about, but that is definitely not the case today. So let me just do a quick intro for anybody. I'm looking at the names since I don't see most of the faces. For anybody who doesn't know me, I'm Dan Schwimmer. I've was in San Diego for about 40 years, very involved with AIPAC, the pro-Israel American relationship lobby, and a self-professed history buff and a news hound. And I hope that I can give you some insight or synthesis of some issues and trends that you might have read a piece in the paper, but hadn't kind of thought about putting some of the pieces together. So I always try to do something other than report what I know our members are very informed about, and not to be repetitive. So I hope that I can accomplish that today. As always, I like to start with a disclaimer that says, I try to tell you when I say my opinion versus something that I think is a fact. And if you catch me saying something that's really an opinion as a fact, by all means, call me out for it. You can't hurt my feelings. So let's just start with a brief summary of AIPAC, which supports the American-Israel relationship. I've been involved for decades, and because of the way the world is and the environment, the political environment that we are involved in, AIPAC has made some very, very substantial changes in the last year, ones I really never saw coming. We have said in AIPAC all the time that I've been involved, we have friends in Congress and we have potential friends in Congress. We don't have opponents or enemies. Well, the philosophy has changed. We now have friends and we have those who we would like to defeat, who oppose the American-Israel relationship. It has come to a point, obviously, the top brass in the organization have decided that we really do need to oppose the re-election of people who oppose the American-Israel relationship. And that is a sea change. The second change at AIPAC is we have always said we don't rate, endorse, or raise money for any candidates. That is also gone. AIPAC has now created a PAC, a political action committee, to raise funds to support politicians who support the American-Israel relationship. That is another gigantic change. And the third thing that has changed substantially is that we always lobbied all 535 members of Congress, 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate. That AIPAC has decided that they just don't have the bandwidth to effectively do that anymore. And so we will continue to lobby all 100 senators and about 120 of the most influential members of the House. That number will go up and down. But we are trying to tunnel focus our efforts and our financial involvement with the most important members of Congress. So it's really an interesting kind of deal. The two things that have recently happened that are very, very important relative to AIPAC and Congress is, number one, both houses just recently passed an omnibus spending bill. And both bills include, I don't believe the president has signed it yet, but I'm sure that he's going to, if he hasn't already today. It includes $3.8 billion of military assistance to Israel. That's 3.3 in regular assistance and 500 million in missile defense related activities. Plus, in this particular bill, an appropriation of $1 billion from last year that did not pass last year because of opposition from one senator, Rand Paul, who I'm not going to rag on him. He's very consistent. He doesn't believe in the U.S. getting involved overseas. $1 billion for replenishment of the Iron Dome interceptors, which Israel depleted their supply in the latest Gaza interaction, when Gaza launched 4,000 rockets at Israel, and Israel took down.
Oh, the war.
Yep. We've got somebody out there. They depleted their inventory, and they took down 90% of 4,000 incoming rockets. So they used a lot of interceptors. So that's what's been going on with AIPAC. That's what's going on with Congress. As always, it's very, very important to educate members of Congress. And so just at the end of February, there was a congressional delegation trip sponsored by the American Israel Education Federation, AIEF. That's a nonprofit educational arm of AIPAC that takes members to Israel so that they can, especially freshmen, 40 Republican members, mostly freshmen, 14 Democrats, mostly freshmen, went to Israel on these 2 trips, and then they spent about a day and a half together while they were there. And you get the reaction from these new members, and you get. I picked a couple of choices, comments. It was very interesting. They met, as they always do when the congressional delegations go to Israel. AIPAC puts them with members of the Palestinian Authority, and AIPAC's never in the room. Okay, this is just members of Congress and the PA. And this year they met with PA Prime Minister Mohammed Shataya. I'm not sure if I pronounce it right, doesn't matter. Who, during his discussion with the members, dismissed Hamas rocket attacks against Israel. Again, I mentioned there were more than 4,000 of them, all right, in May of 2021, as fireworks. That was his word. That's the quote of the members. According to one of the representatives, his remarks, quote, really annoyed people in the congressional delegation and reinforced the view that the Palestinians are not ready to have an adult conversation, that their narrative was all victimhood and blaming Israel for everything. They're not responsible for anything. And it's amazing because I've had this conversation many times, and I've heard this from many members who have gone and AIPAC staff who have done the trips, that AIPAC is never afraid to leave members of Congress with members of the Palestinian Authority because they do the same thing every single time. They put their foot in their mouths in front of representatives of the United States government and pretend that they're completely not responsible and they're purely the victims. That shouldn't surprise anybody. It is the narrative. So let's go on and talk about a couple of the current themes and problems that are going on today. One of them obviously is Ukraine. What is the impact of Ukraine on Israel? Okay, so how do those two, what are the interactions? So the first thing to know is that Israel is caught in the middle. All right, we've got about 1 million Russian immigrants. Now that would include immigrants from Ukraine because they came from what was the Soviet Union at the time in Israel. Israel has a tight relationship with both Russia and with Ukraine. But Israel also has a very important, so they have a very close relationship with Ukraine, but they also have a close relationship with Putin in Russia. And why is that? And that's because of Syria. Russia controls the skies over Syria. They have Russian boots on the ground. They have Russian anti-aircraft batteries. And Russia allows Israel freedom of the skies to go after Iran's attempt to establish bases and import arms into Syria. Israel has done hundreds and admitted that they are regularly attacking Iranian positions in Syria. And without Russian approval and standing down their anti-aircraft batteries, it would be, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would be much more difficult for Israel to operate against Iran in Syria without Putin's tactic approval. So it's very, very important for Israel not to piss off the Russians and Putin. So it's a very delicate balance. Now, I think most of us know that Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has been offering up to negotiate as a go-between between Russia and Ukraine. He has flown to Moscow. He's met with Putin. Then he immediately got on the phone with Ukraine, and he's been going back and forth. And he's been meeting, and this is all with the approval of the Biden administration. So Israel's walking a tightrope. It's a delicate balance. It's a no-win situation for Israel. They're going to try their very best to do what they can do. So just a couple of quotes. Natan Sharansky wrote an editorial in the Wall Street Journal about the moral obligation of Israel to side with Ukraine. And he said, quote, "It's not cowardice for Israel to seek to avoid irritating Putin. we are in a position, we, Israel, are in a position where, because of the weakness of the West, which invited Putin into Syria or allowed it, Putin holds the keys to the skies in our area. To protect ourselves from Iran, from the military bases that Iran would establish directly on our borders, we need good ties with Russia, unquote. What's interesting is, because the war for Russia in Ukraine is not going very well, they are now in a position where they're doing two things. They're recruiting Syrians to go fight on behalf of Russia and Ukraine, and more importantly, they are starting to transfer some troops that they have in Syria to Ukraine. This is not good for Israel, because it will give Iran more leeway and more runway, and that's a problem. So this is a very early, just happening, developing kind of scenario to watch. We need to be careful about it. Now let's just talk about for 1 second the background of the whole Ukraine situation. Now, some people are going to know this, some aren't. In 1994, as the Soviet Union was disintegrating, or after it disintegrated, there was an agreement. There were a lot, I don't know the exact number, but tens of nuclear missiles, Russian nuclear missiles, sighted in Ukraine. The US was extremely nervous about having nuclear missiles spread out across the geography and outside of the Russian government's control. So there was an agreement wherein Ukraine committed and did transfer all their nuclear weapons back to Russia in return for the guarantee of their sovereignty of their borders. Russia and the United States both guaranteed the integrity of the state of Ukraine, okay, of the country, of their borders. Putin obviously has abrogated that commitment, and the United States has not stood firm to protect Ukraine. It's not to say we're not doing some steps, but the bottom line for other countries watching is, what's the lesson, right? So I'm going to get to that in another piece of the lecture, but that's the long range issue that we have to be very aware of. Okay, so despite America's warnings and threats against Russia invading Ukraine, obviously Russia did it anyway. And what are we doing that's effective in response? And so it brings up the question of international guarantees. I don't know how many times we have heard about how this peace plan or that plan for Israel and the Palestinians and so on is going to be guaranteed by international members of the international community, are going to guard the borders. Well, Israel has never wanted that. They've always said that they want to enforce their own security by themselves, for themselves. They never want any other foreign boots on the ground, because it just complicates everything. So the second issue is, the issue of deterrence, right? What was the deterrence that was presented to Putin to keep him or disavow him of his invasion of Ukraine? There wasn't much, right? There were some threats about sanctions, okay? But they weren't, whatever the deterrent was, it wasn't strong enough to have deterred him. Israel knows this lesson well, right? Israel is all about deterrence. Now, they catch hell for it every time they try to make sure that a bad actor in their neighborhood knows, don't mess with us, because this is what you're going to get. And then they give it to them when they do it, and then the world goes crazy. But then usually, for instance, Hamas, they'll stand down for a number of years, or Hezbollah will stand down for a number of years. So it's very, very important, this whole issue of deterrence. I love this quote: Israelis have learned that they must forget about being popular so long as they are strong enough to resist campaigns aimed at their destruction. And that is what Israel does its very best to do. Are they bad at public relations and making their own case? Yeah, generally they are. But the reality is, and we all have to understand this, is Israel needs to take the actions necessary to both protect its citizens, its borders, and to create a deterrent to prevent tomorrow's recurrence. So it's very important. The next piece of what's going on between Israel and Ukraine is the estimates are that there are approximately 200,000 Jews left in Ukraine. Israel is preparing to absorb 100,000 of them, for 100,000 of them to make Aliyah. So it's going to be yet another international saving of a group of Jews in Israel, which is really, just it should make your heart be proud that you're involved and you're concerned about Israel and you participate in what Israel does for Jews of the world. This is yet another example. Israel has set up, I believe, 10 stations at border crossings from Ukraine into various countries where they're screening and taking care to house. They've rented 2,100 hotel rooms outside of Ukraine in the bordering countries to house Jews who they're transferring to Israel. So Israel is on the ground, on the borders, trying to help Ukrainian Jews to make Aliyah, to come to Israel. And here's a point to think about. These people are not going to be displaced people. They're not going to be refugees. They're going to be olim, right? They are going to be citizens of the state of Israel. They're going to be accepted. They're going to be home, not homeless. It's a really, you got to stop and think about it for a second, because in Syria, there's 5 million people who have left the country and they're living in Jordan and everywhere in Iraq and Lebanon, and they're homeless, right? And the people who have left Venezuela, a couple million, 2 to 3 million of them have left and are across borders. They're homeless. These Ukrainian Jews will not be homeless. And I think that is really an exciting and proud moment for us as a Jewish community. Another piece that's going on between the Ukrainian invasion and Israel is there's chatter and there's complaints from the pro-Palestinian world that, hey, wait a minute, the world is going, look at the Ukrainians with their Molotov cocktails and their urban resistance, and they're resisting the Russians. And when we do that, well, everybody blasts us and calls us terrorists. Well, how come we don't get lauded when we resist Israeli occupation, when the Ukrainians get all this great press in the world for resisting the Russians? Well, the big difference, of course, is that Ukrainians aren't blowing up Russian buses in Moscow. They're not naming streets after people who have killed Russian school children. They're not throwing Molotov cocktails into the cars of civilians, right? These are all things that the Palestinians do. They've just got the narrative so unbelievably warped. And so I think that in the long run, a positive for Israel out of this is that the world, and maybe I'm being Pollyannish, I don't know, that when we watch this massive destruction that's going on, that Russia is putting on the Ukrainians and destroying their cities and apparently indiscriminately just killing civilians and bombing hospitals, that the Palestinian narrative of, oh, they're evicting 3 families from this neighborhood, the whole world should stop and come down on Israel. I mean, these are nothing issues compared to this invasion and total bombing of a country, right? So I think that there is a potential narrative that undermines the whole Palestinian narrative that they like to present to the world. And I think it's bad for the Palestinian cause, but that's where we are. So I think there's a lot of little issues. Well, not little, but I think these are the main issues related to Israel and the Ukraine. But the hardest one is tiptoeing between supporting Ukraine. Like, for instance, there were 2 votes in the United Nations. One was in the Security Council, which Israel abstained, and then one was in the General Assembly, which Israel joined. They're trying to balance very, very carefully and choose their actions and choose their words. So we will see how that plays out. In the very recent current environment and recent past, there's been a development on another front, and we've talked about it over the years, and that's Turkey. Turkey, since the Gaza, their attempt, what's it called, the Mari Mara, the ship that Israel boarded, and some Turkish citizens got killed. And at that point, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, went crazy on Israel, right? Including live on stage with Perez, where he just walked off stage and yelled at him. He practically spit at him. Anyway, Turkey's having some issues. Erdogan is up for an election, and he's actually got problems. I mean, because Turkey has massive economic problems. Erdogan is a big believer that you contain inflation by lowering interest rates. He has the exact opposite theory as the rest of the economists on the planet. And he's had about 3 or 4 finance ministers, all of whom he has fired. And they're, quote, head of their Federal Reserve. Every time somebody says, no, you can't raid our reserves, he fires them. So he is trying to reach out to multiple countries, including Israel. And so President Herzog, the president of Israel, was just in Turkey. He met with Erdogan. Erdogan greeted him, gave him an honor guard. They played the Israeli national anthem. All of these are symbolic. These are not come in the back door, the side door of the White House kind of thing, kind of like what Obama made Bibi do. This is upfront. This is an attempt at rapprochement, right? What does Erdogan want? One of the things Erdogan wants is he wants a piece of the Eastern Mediterranean oil and gas that Israel is running the show on, right? He's been boxed out. Israel is doing deals with Greece and with Cyprus and with Jordan and with Egypt, but nothing with Turkey. And Erdogan wants a piece of that. What does Israel want? First of all, what they want is a go slow, because they know that Erdogan has not changed his stripes. Okay, let me just give you a couple of quotes. Herzog said, "We shall try to restart our relations and build them in a measured and cautious manner and with mutual respect between our states." That's got like 4 qualifiers in one sentence, okay? What did Erdogan say? Erdogan said, Herzog's historic visit will be a turning point in relations between Turkey and Israel. Okay, so he's trying to be all, warm and fuzzy, and Israel's like, we're going to be careful about this. What does, let me give you some examples of Erdogan's opinion and process with Israel over the last several years. Erdogan has long been a supporter of Hamas. Hamas has an office in Turkey. There's virtually undeniable proof that they have planned and launched attacks on Israel from the offices in Turkey. So first and foremost, Israel wants Erdogan to kick Hamas out of Turkey, okay? But here's some comments by Erdogan, just to make sure you understand where he's coming from. Erdogan accused Israel, the Israeli people, of genocide, called Nazism, called Zionism a crime against humanity, and said, we view the Holocaust in the same way we view those besieging Gaza and carrying out massacres in it. Okay, so now you have a flavor for Erdogan's opinion of Israel and the Jews. But Israel, what does Israel want? Israel wants Erdogan to do several things besides kick Hamas out, which is the number one. They also want him to stop his anti-Israel posturing and comments, stop financially backing those agitating on the Temple Mount. Turkey funds a lot of the, quote, NGOs in the Palestinian environment that are constantly doing the assault on the Al-Aqsa, right? Save the Al-Aqsa. The Jews are trying to take over Al-Aqsa, destroy blah, blah, blah. He's the money behind that. Israel wants to stop Turkey from blocking Israeli cooperation with NATO. Now, Israel was just accepted into the U.S. CENTCOM section of the military, of the U.S. military, which is a really big step up. So now Israel is participating in a lot of the Middle Eastern joint military exercises. And this is also a result of the Abraham Accords, which I'll talk about a little bit later in the good news. And there's a lot of good news today. I mean, I know we got trouble, but as always, but we do have a lot. They want to stop, they want Turkey to stop trying to undermine Israel's increasing relationships under the Abraham Accords with other Middle East entities. You know, they want to be the big boy in the neighborhood, and they don't want Israel to develop good relationships. So there's a lot of things going on. It could be a very positive development. All right. I mean, Israelis vacation in Turkey like crazy. Erdogan, there's a lot of trade, there's a lot of travel. It would be nice if Israel and Turkey could make nice on each other and resume being allies. We will see. The future is absolutely uncertain, but it is a very positive development that Erdogan has been backed into a corner that he needs to try to negotiate and build relationships to get out of. So I think that's a thing to watch. So the other big issue that we hear about all the time is the Jcpoa, right? The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal. And what is going on? We know, I think everybody on this call knows that the current Biden administration is dead set, absolutely hell-bent on reinstituting the deal. Yeah, man, I don't think that's a qualitative, I don't think that's an opinion. I think that's factual. I mean, they've said since day one during the campaign, before they were in office, this is what they want, and they've taken insult and injury and have negotiated from I would say a position of weakness right on through. Now, I'm gonna talk about some of the problems, but in the end, I'm gonna tell you what I think is a reason that I don't think you're probably have ever heard about why that deal might be good for Israel. But right now, all the top people in Israel are against the deal vocally, right? They're telling the U.S. administration, they're telling their European counterparts, the Arabs are surrounding Arab countries are all against it. So there are numerous problems with it. So what would this new deal do, right? Okay, so all we have are press releases at this point. A lot of them are leaks from the negotiating team, but also you have to keep in mind that the people at the negotiating table for the United States on this deal are the same people who negotiated the deal in 2015, okay? Wendy Sherman and Mallory, you know, John Kerry's not there, but the two people below him are now 1 and 2. So the numbers 2 and 3 back then are now numbers 1 and 2. They have the exact same opinion, and their opinion is that internationalism is better than nationalism, and that if we're just nice to Iran, then they will play nice. If we give them economic relief, they'll stop being bad boys in the neighborhood. I would say that is an incredibly naive and proven by behavior, not my intuition or my opinion of things that have happened, but it's almost impossible to argue that just plain out hasn't worked. And that was absolutely the theory in 2015. Now, we can argue all day long about whether or not Trump pulling out of the deal and applying maximum pressure on Iran helped or hurt the process of delaying Iran's race to a nuclear bomb. Now, you know that even today, at least Iran is consistent, they still deny that they're looking for a bomb, okay? They're not working on it, it's all civilian purposes. They have enough enriched uranium at 60%, they need 95%. And I've said this many times, it's not a linear curve, okay? The first 5% probably takes half the time, and then the curve just goes straight up. So to get from 60 to 95 is very, very easy, not nearly the amount of time as it takes to go from no enrichment to like 5% enrichment, Okay, so the only known use of 60% enriched uranium on the planet is for a nuclear device. That there is no other known use. So for them to say that they only have a peaceful nuclear program is just, you gotta want to believe them. I mean, because no fact supports it. All right. So there are several things that this deal would do, according to reports, right? It would leave their nuclear processing infrastructure in place. So they get to hold on to all of their centrifuges. And they, back in 2015, they were using what are called IR2s. That's the spinners. That's what spins to enrich uranium. Now they're using IR6s and IR8s. They're 10 to 20 times more efficient than an IR2, which is why their breakout time to process and enrich uranium is now, depending on who you read, it's either weeks or months. And it's certainly, when they talk weeks, they talk 3 to 6 weeks. And when they talk months, they're talking 2 to 4 months. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, just came out on March 3rd with a report on Iranian nuclear stockpiles. And if you do the math and you're very careful with where they are and what they can do, they could have enough enriched uranium for 4 bombs in 4 months, according to the IAEA report. There was a confidential briefing to members of the Senate about a month ago. It was back in February sometime. And apparently numerous senators were shocked that Iran was so close to having enough uranium to build a bomb. Now, I've said this before, and for those of you who haven't heard it, let's be real clear. It takes 3 different components to have a bomb that you can threaten somebody with. So you need the enriched uranium as the fuel. You need to create the bomb. You need to build a bomb, not only that will implode and start a nuclear reaction, but theoretically, if you're going to put it on a ballistic missile, it's got to be able to survive the G forces and all the vibration and the impact of liftoff and re-entry into the atmosphere. And third, you need the missiles. They've got the uranium and they've got the missiles. Israel, from everything I've read, Israel and the United States do not believe that they have the ability to make the bomb yet. They think it will take them a year or 2 to create an actual bomb. So when you hear that they have enough material to build a bomb, that doesn't mean they have a bomb. So be clear about that. But that's the first, that's been a hurdle, a gigantic hurdle, a technological hurdle and time hurdle. So they're moving forward on that. What would this deal do besides leave intact their whole infrastructure? It would give them access to approximately $100 billion of foreign reserves that are frozen overseas, okay, by sanctions. So in 2020, at the end of 2020, Iran was down to $4 billion of available foreign reserves. I mean, they were about to be choked off from, I mean, you have to have foreign reserves in order to buy import goods, because you have to be able to pay for them in somebody else's currency. So that's what foreign reserves end up being. And without foreign reserves, basically, you're out of the international business. So it was a critical time when you really had Iran kind of backed into a corner. So what happened in 2021? The new administration comes in. They got Iran in the corner, but they want to be nice to Iran because they want to renegotiate the deal. So the administration pulled way back on enforcing the sanctions, and Iran was then able to start generating foreign reserves by selling millions of barrels of oil a day. They eased Iran's access to some of those foreign funds, and they halted pressure on Iran to declare its unknown or secret nuclear works. And what I mean by that is, back in 2019, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, found evidence, because either an Iranian opposition group or Israel gave them the information of where it was. And if you remember Bibi in front of the UN with a picture of a warehouse saying this was a nuclear site. They were storing nuclear, and of course Iran said, you know, it was a candle factory or something. Well, the IAEA finally, after a year, went in there after Iran tried to dig up all the dirt and remove it, and found traces of radioactivity there, which proved that there was radioactive material there. And they've been after Iran to explain it. And Iran has stonewalled and refused to. And that's one of Iran's demands in these negotiations, is that we're not answering any of those questions. Well, just this week, the IAEA, the head of the IAEA, was in Iran. And after he met with Iranian officials, he said, we have an agreement that Iran will answer these questions in the next 6 months. Now, if you're like me, I'm like, yeah, right. Now that's going to happen like it's happened in the last 3 years. I just don't think that's going to happen. But one of the things that the Obama administration said when they were negotiating the original agreement was, we're going to find out about all of their weapon development activities up to this point, because how can we possibly know how close they are to a usable bomb if we have no idea how close they are to a weapon? And they completely dropped that, and they never made Iran explain all of their previous activities so that we could determine how close they were, and we still don't know. So they've got undeclared sites where they're doing work, and the new agreement will still have all military sites where they're doing nuclear work off limits to inspections. So the inspection regime, remember the whole, oh, if they don't let us do this or they violate it, they're going to be snapbacks. Those are gone. And you see they didn't work. I mean, you know, there were violations, and they had too much heavy water, and they had too high a quantity or level of enrichment, and nothing ever happened under the rules. So, and the rules took months and months, and they could, you know, clear sites before they ever got investigated. So the new agreement gives them access to hundreds of billions of dollars. It lifts sanctions on their sales so that they can create enormous foreign reserves and cash flow. And what are they going to do with that money? If the first deal was any indication, what they're going to do with it is they're going to use it to spread more mayhem, right? They're going to fund the Houthis in Yemen, who are attacking the UAE and Saudi Arabia. They're going to fund Hezbollah, who has stymied and destroyed the country of Lebanon, and is, along with the Russians, the de facto rulers in Syria. They're going to fund Hamas and Islamic Jihad to harass Israel. So they're going to work and continue to work on their ballistic missile program and their drone program. And they're going to just harass everybody in the Middle East. And you got to wonder why the administration thinks that's a good idea. But they just don't seem to think that's a problem. So the US in 2021 backed way off. What did Iran do in response? They ramped up all their activities. They ramped up the number of missile attacks. They ramped up their support for the Houthis and for Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah. And they just made more and more trouble. They launched missiles at US bases, which they just did a week ago, right? About a mile away from a new American consulate facility in northeastern Iraq in the Kurdish area. They sent a couple of missiles and it's no coincidence. They said, oh, we're after Israeli intelligence positions. Oh, what a bunch of crap. You know, it was a kilometer away from the American base. These missiles and drones don't travel 1,000 miles and miss something by a kilometer because they weren't aiming. That I just absolutely don't believe it. But it's the first time that Iran has felt comfortable enough to just say, yeah, it was us. That came from our territory. We launched those rockets. Usually they blame it on Iraqi Shiites or Houthis or Islamic Jihad or Hamas. It's always somebody else who they gave the weapons to doing the launching. But this time they're like, no, we want the Americans to know this is us. All right. So I think, you know, the underlying challenge for me on the whole Iran negotiations is the assumption that if we just let take the economic boot off of their neck, that if we're nice to them, then they'll behave. And I think that that is just a fundamental misinterpretation and misunderstanding of the Iranian negotiating position. There was an article, I think, in the Wall Street Journal, where they quoted the Russian diplomat who's involved in the Vienna nuclear talks, because the U.S. isn't allowed in the room, right? We go sit in some other hotel or some other room, and the Russian emissary basically comes back and forth. And he said, yeah, the Iranians, they negotiate every comma, every period, every word. And the U.S., and they've gotten, according to the Russian diplomat, that the Iranians have gotten way more than he could have ever imagined that they would get in these negotiations. I mean, the U.S. team, 4 members of the U.S. team resigned last month because of the positions taken by the leading negotiators of the U.S. So 4 Americans who were more hardline than Mallory or Wendy Sherman, who are leading the negotiation, they just said we can't be part of this. I mean, this is just a giveaway. So it's really chaotic. Iran has been emboldened by the Russia-Ukraine, by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the split between the U.S. and Russia. Okay, so, and the spike in oil prices has emboldened Iran. They're like looking at more money, less cooperation from those who they're negotiating with, and so they have made new demands. But the question becomes, how close are we to a deal, right? I've read numerous editorials that say, oh, we're so close that it's only, and then fill in the blank, right? And I'll go through some of the blanks here in a second. Or I've read some analysis that is very interesting. Just, I'm going to say 2 weeks ago, there was an article that said significant differences remain on several key issues, which include the scope of American sanctions relief. Well, that's like Iran's #1 issue. If we haven't agreed on the scope of sanctions relief, I don't know where we are in the negotiations. Continued Iranian demands that the U.S. provide stronger guarantees that it won't exit the deal again. Now, that is a problematic demand, one that the U.S. the administration cannot satisfy, because the only way to satisfy that demand is for this agreement to be a treaty. For it to become a treaty, it has to be submitted to Congress, and the administration knows, just like Obama knew he did not have the votes to approve it as a treaty, Biden does not either. Okay, I mean, just this week, 14 Democratic members of Congress and 8 Republican members of Congress sent a letter to the president saying, we not only don't we support what we're reading about this deal's going to be, but we're going to oppose it. I mean, this you can't do this deal. So he knows he doesn't have support, not only from his own party, enough to turn it into a treaty. So it's going to be the same as what Obama agreed to, which was an executive order. And that can be overturned by the next president, just as Trump overturned it, because it was an executive order from President Obama. So they're not going to get that one. The U.S. pushed to ensure a prisoner swap. There are some Americans that are being held in Iran under very specious charges. And so the U.S. is trying to put that in. It was one of the points that people wanted in the 2015 negotiations and that we never put in. And now here we are 7 years later, still negotiating for some of the same people. So it's interesting that the U.S. is negotiating in good faith with an entity that just launched missiles at our troops stationed in Iraq. I mean, as I've said many, many times, international relations are very complicated. People who say, oh, it's just so simple. It's never simple. So, and sometimes you have to say, well, I'm just going to have to look the other way on that one. We just have to stay true to the course and see what we can get done on this big issue and leave this smaller issue. Okay, well, we're going to get to another example of that in a bit, where we haven't done that, and now it's biting us in the behind. So Iran wants to shut down the investigation into previous military components of their process. They want, and supposedly this is one of the things that the members of Congress really are up in arms about, is Iran is demanding. The U.S. has labeled the IRGC, the the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, okay, as a terrorist organization. This is the military arm of the Iranian military that is under the direct control of the Ayatollah, and it's the one that ferments and propagates its mayhem all over the world. And it's estimated that members of the IRGC and the supreme leader own between 25 and 50% of the Iranian economy. They're kleptocrats, right? It's a kleptocracy. They just grab industries and they own and control them. But most importantly is their military activities. The U.S. supposedly is going to agree to that, to remove them from the terrorism list. Now, the U.S. has shown that it's willing to do stuff like that, because Biden, early on in his administration in 21, removed the Houthis from the terrorism list, and subsequent to his removing them from their designation as a terrorist group, they bombed the UAE. They attempted to bomb the UAE airport, and they've sent several dozen rockets and drones at Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia and the UAE are furious at the United States for refusing to put the Houthis back on the terrorism list, for launching rockets and drones at their infrastructure, at their civilians, and their industrial output. So that kind of relationship, and taking, and the only reason that the U.S. removed the Houthis is to, again, try to be nice to Iran so that they'll agree to the Jcpoa negotiations. So everything's kind of linked, but there are very strong arguments for doing or not doing some of these things. And so now when President Biden picks up the phone and calls Saudi Arabia to say, hey, we need you to pump more oil because, we're going to cut off Russian oil and the world's going crazy on oil prices, and I got a political problem because oil prices are so high. You know what the Saudis said? They didn't even pick up the phone. Either did the UAE. And those are the only two countries that have ready, immediate, spare capacity to ramp up and provide supply into the world in anything more than a negligible amount. Neither one of them would take Biden's call. It wasn't even to say no. They didn't even say no. They just said, we're not answering the phone. All you've done is criticize us for our human rights. All you do is declassify our enemies who are launching rockets and mortars at us, drones. So you know what? We got nothing to talk about. You made the mess. You go sit in, and that's really unfortunate, and it's too bad. But here's the biggest stick in the wheel of completing the deal. Oh, hang on one second. I got my apparently it's my siren, my tornado siren is going off, and I don't think it's because we have a tornado warning. It must be our weekly special. I grew up in Michigan, and we always had those. It was like Saturday at noon, the sirens would go off. Well, anyway, at least it's not Israel, and it's not red alert. So I'm not running for a bomb shelter, and I'm happy for that. But here's the biggest thorn in the negotiations that just came out. Russia has demanded that any sanctions on Russia because of their invasion of Ukraine will not apply to their trade or any activities with Iran. Now, wait a minute. Let's think about that for a second. That gives Russia a hole the size of a train tunnel to avoid sanctions. They'll run all their commerce right through Iran and right around the sanctions. They'll sell all their oil or gas through Iran. They'll use them as a conduit, and it's a problem that immediately caused the talks to stop. The talks in Vienna have been recessed. Everybody's gone home, quote, to check with their governments. The US is now saying, well, maybe we need to find a way to make a deal with Iran without Russia involved. Because Anthony Blinken said on Sunday on, the press, Meet the Press, whichever one of the Sunday talk shows, said, we will not accommodate Russia in order to make the Iran deal. And good for him. I think it's wonderful to hear it. Whether or not they stick to that, we'll see. But now let's think about this at a couple of different layers, because these are the things that you don't really read. But there is a case to be made that Russia doesn't want this deal to happen. Now, they might have wanted it before. But what happens if the US makes a deal with Iran and lifts sanctions? The very first thing, the two immediate things that happen are Iran gets access to a ton of money, and they get to start selling oil open, right? If Iran brings millions of barrels a day into the world oil market, who does that hurt first and foremost? It hurts Russia, because Russia's biggest lever over Europe and trying to contain Europe's resistance or response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine is how much oil and gas Europe gets from Russia. And it's like 40+%. Okay. Now, lucky for Europe, the winter is almost over. And so it's not going into winter where Russia can threaten to just shut them down. But they're having enormous price spikes in Europe that are hurting their industry, hurting their economies. So Russia would be hurt in that respect by a deal between the US and Iran to lift sanctions. But on the other hand, Russia would benefit from a deal because Iran would have gobs of money. And what is one of the first things they're going to do with $100 billion and cash flow? They're going to buy armament systems. And who are they going to buy them from? The only country on the planet that will sell them to them, Russia. So Russia is very excited to sell billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of armaments to Iran. So it's a very interesting little push-pull, what's going to happen here as to how that's going to be. Let me give you one more piece of how Iran and Russia and the war in Ukraine and the relations play out. Part of the Jcpoa is that Iran's got all this enriched uranium above the, I think it was like 3.56%, whatever it is. It's under 5% enrichment level. It's a very, very specific number. It's very low, that they were supposed to have kept and not exceeded under the 2015 deal. Now they've got all this 60% enriched. So what happens? The deal is that they're supposed to ship all of that enriched uranium out of the country. Where? To Russia. Russia is supposed to hold all of Iran's enriched uranium, okay, to keep Iranian hands off of it. Well, I don't know about you, but I want to say I don't really trust the Russians to be good stewards of that very, very valuable product, especially if Iran becomes their conduit to the world economy. It becomes their little side door. Iran is going to have tremendous leverage over Russia economically if Russia is dependent upon Iran to break the sanctions. So you see how these start to play together? They start to intertwine, and you go, oh, man, the structure of this deal is so dangerous. There are so many motivations to not comply, and you got bad actors that you're trying to trust to do what they say they're going to do, who have not done what they've said they were going to do in the past. So, we're playing with fire here. Now, the opposite argument, and I'll make the counter argument, and that is, well, if we don't do this deal, Iran has been racing forward on all fronts, on missile development, on weapon development, although they deny it. They found elements of them trying to build the casings for a bomb, and the actual enrichment. They'll just keep flying, right? And they've restricted AIEA access for monitoring their inventories and where is their enriched uranium and what are they doing where. They still have off limits on all their military facilities. So the argument for the deal is that, well, at least we hit the pause button. We at least can buy, it depends on what analysis you read about whether it's years, 18 months, when some of the restrictions start to fall off in 2025 or 2024, or a number of years that you hold off on Iran's program. But, I'm not confident in any of those timeframes because I think Iran is cheating. I think they're cheating every single day. They've been caught cheating. The only time they ever admit anything is when they get caught, and they've been caught several times over the years. So I really don't have any trust in what they say they have done, will do, or are doing. But let me do the last point. I'm going to divert for a second, then I'm going to come back and you're going to understand where I'm going on this Jcpoa and what the potential benefit to Israel is. So let me divert for a second and go to the topic of how many missiles and rockets does Hezbollah have in Lebanon pointed at Israel. Okay, so they're estimating, now I'm going to tie this together, I promise, in a minute. It's estimated Hezbollah has about 100 long-range precision missiles aimed at Raquel, I think you're off mute there, darling.
Friends, they didn't like the sausage and biscuit for breakfast, so they gave it to us. So we're saving.
Raquel,
Yes.
can you mute for me, please?
Can I go up?
Can you mute your computer?
Yes.
Thank you. There we go. Thank you. So they have, it's estimated they have 100 long-range missiles. It's estimated that they have 2,000 UAVs, right? Unmanned aerial vehicles. It's estimated they have 145,000 mortars and 65,000 short-range rockets. Now, having watched the last Gaza incursion, where Hamas and Islamic Jihad launched 4,000 rockets at Israel, and Israel depleted, we don't know how substantially they depleted their inventory of Iron Dome interceptors, but the bottom line is there's maybe 10,000 rockets in Gaza. There's 200,000 projectiles of various sorts that Hezbollah has in Lebanon. Why is that important, and how does this tie in? So if Israel takes action, military action against the Iranian nuclear project and facilities, the expectation is that Iran will turn Hezbollah loose on Israel to create a multi-front war and force Israel to defend against Gaza, to defend against Lebanon, and to defend against Iranian response. Israel, I don't care how many Iron Dome interceptors they have, it won't be enough. So what is the answer? The answer is what's in development, and that's laser, okay? Kinetic, what do they call it? Not kinetic energy, but anyway, it's it's a laser defense system. The lasers can, they can just fire ad nauseum. As long as you have a power source, they can keep firing. But there are challenges to the laser technology. Number one, you have to, there's weather issues with it. It doesn't do well in bad weather. That's problem number one. Problem number two is you have to keep the laser on target for like 2 to 3 seconds to heat up the projectile, and then it basically blows it up. It melts it, right? Or it makes it that it can't fly on a trajectory because it's got a hole in it, blah, blah, blah. The problem is a lot of these systems, these rocket systems, can launch 2-4 rockets per second. And if we've got 2 or 3 seconds to blow up one, you got 6 more coming. So it's going to have to be a very robust system. But Israel has said that they are building a, quote, laser wall. Now, once Israel has that technology, and the US has been working on this technology for years, over a decade. We have a 747 with a gigantic laser in the nose, okay, for aerial, bringing down an ICBM is what we've been working on. But Israel's working on the shorter range stuff. Right now, these lasers only have about a 5 or 6 mile effective distance before the heat comes out of the laser. And it's not enough. And of course, the thicker the weapon coming at it, the longer on target you have to be to burn it up or blow it up. So how does that work in and tie in with the Jcpoa? I would argue that, in my mind, the most beneficial aspect of going back into the deal and buying a couple more years where Iran's program kind of sits in neutral, at least on the surface, what they're doing below the surface, again, we've talked about, could give Israel enough time to deploy a laser defense system. And then they would have a much freer hand to go after the physical plant of the Iranian nuclear program. And in the meantime, of course, they're always trying to hit the scientists, they're trying to hit a facility, they're trying to blow up this, they're doing, the Stuxnet, get after the software. I mean, Israel is actively trying to slow the Iranian project down. That's nothing new. And they will continue to do that. But in my mind, that's the only positive of this, is to give them enough time to develop and deploy this laser technology. And if they could do that, it would be phenomenal. And I'm telling you, if Israel does this, it could change warfare, offense and defense as we know it on the planet. It really could. It could render so many weapon systems useless. So, and am I more optimistic that Israel will develop it, despite the fact that the U.S. has been trying to develop it for years? Well, yeah, I am. I mean, they certainly got to Iron Dome much faster. The United States was working on a missile intercept, and now we're buying Iron Domes from Israel, right? The U.S. was working on defense for tanks, from anti-tank missiles. Israel is the one that developed a system, and now the U.S. has bought their anti-tank system. I mean, do I think that Israel will get there before the U.S.? Well, yes, I do. So let me switch gears and go to another kind of a macro view. Let me just plant a couple of seeds for you to think about, because I read an an editorial, an opinion, what have you, that really struck me. And let me read it to you. And this was in the Wall Street Journal editorial page on February 25th. And they said, some Americans want to concede Russia this sphere of influence, talking about Ukraine, and say it is Europe's problem. And I read that and I went, well, that's me. I'm like, this is not the US's problem. But here's their follow-on, and this is what's, I think, worthy of thought. But in a world in which Russia dominates Eastern and Central Europe, Iran dominates the Middle East, and China dominates East Asia, that world will not be safe for US interests. Regional powers have a habit of becoming global threats, especially when they work together in concert, as Russia, China, and Iran are currently doing. That's a scary thought. We are in a bit of a different world right now. I mean, on a macro scale, on a global geopolitical scale, things are changing, right? I mean, you read all the time about how China more and more is threatening Taiwan, and how Iran obviously threatens its Sunni neighbors all over the Gulf, and Russia clearly is threatening Eastern Europe. So you could take each one and you could break it down, but this kind of sets up a global thought. And so I wanted to plant that. I will go on record and say that I am not a fan of the US being the world's policeman. I never have been. I don't think I ever will be. That's not to say that somebody doesn't need to step in, but every time we step out, the vacuum gets filled. And it's just the natural way that things go in the world of geopolitics. So I'm not saying I have answers. Very complicated, but we've got some major themes. I think, again, on a global macro scale, the larger meaning of Russia's Ukraine invasion is that the world has entered a dangerous new phase. This is a different editorial. The post-Cold War order has depended on U.S. economic and military power, not on the illusion of an international community that will enforce world order. We've tried that. It hasn't worked very well, right? If somebody can give me an example of international cooperation to solve a regional problem, I'm all ears. I know the first Gulf War, Bush 1 assembled a huge international armada to go and kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. I would say that's an example of international cooperation. I can't think of another one. Europe tried to work on Kosovo and Sarajevo, and they got nowhere. It took some U.S. firepower. Libya, that was a disaster on an international basis. So I don't think the international world is going to come to Taiwan's defense if China decides to go after Taiwan. We're seeing limited world response to Russia in Ukraine. I'm not saying there's none, but I'm not saying it's full on. So could there be a better display, goes on, of United Nations impotence, and I'm no fan of the United Nations, any of you who know me and have heard me know that, than having Russia presiding last month over a Security Council session on Russia's invasion? I mean, but, it's like you got North Korea on the Human Rights Commission. I mean, Cuba, Venezuela, it's crazy. So, but this administration still is a firm believer in internationalism. They have a lot of people in top diplomatic positions who are internationalists, including our negotiating team in Iran. So that's not going to change. I would say this is another, I think, thought-provoking article that I read. This is from Foreign Policy Magazine, February, March, labeled "The Price of Order." And this brings up the point. It says, the choice is no longer between countries with good governance versus bad governance. It's not between democracy or authoritarianism, but it's between harsh governance and no governance, or between order and chaos. With order, you have a chance for economic development and political progress. Without it, you just have a free-for-all where violence dictates, and the golden rule is, in effect, those with the guns rule. And that's what we're seeing in all these failed states. So when the U.S. critiques countries around the world for their human rights, when the Biden administration says, we don't like we don't like MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the effective ruler of Saudi Arabia, because of his involvement in the killing of Khashoggi in the Turkish embassy. Okay, that was a bad incident, no question about it. And they lied and they tried to, deny it, blah, blah, blah. But is that a world geopolitical reason to break relations with a country that produces, I'm not sure what percentage of the world's oil every day? It's somewhere 10-15% of the world's oil. I think it's 80 to 100 million a day, and they're producing 10 million. So 10% of the world's oil every day. You can't do that. And now we're bearing the fruits of those criticisms where they won't even take the president's call. Now that's unheard of to me. The president says, I'd like, hey, it's the White House calling, the president would like to speak to you. Everybody answers that call. Well, now we got countries that won't answer that call. That's really a problem. So it's fascinating what's going on in the world in that respect. So I give you those macro thoughts to chew on, because I think we are really in a transition, a time of transition here in the world. So let's talk about some good news, because I'm running out of time and I always want to do some good news. So, there was an article about Israel announces completion of 40-mile security barrier with Gaza. And I don't know if you guys can see it. You probably can't really see it, but it's a multi-layered barrier. It goes below ground, it goes above ground. It's got, water elements, and it's got seismic elements to detect if the Palestinians are trying to tunnel under it. As it says, it's 40 miles. It's been under construction for 3.5 years. It is now finished. Underground component with sensors, above ground fence, a naval barrier, radar systems, command and control rooms to prevent infiltrations, and of course, a whole series of security cameras. So, a big problem with the Gaza envelope, as it's called, all the Israeli communities that surround Gaza, has been the tunneling, right? The attempt to infiltrate below ground. And Israel feels very confident that this will stop it. Egypt is also building a barrier on the southern border, which is the Sinai border to Gaza, with underground barriers, a giant moat that they fill with seawater to try to stop all of the Palestinian smuggling that goes on underneath the border, and infiltration into Sinai, where they've got problems with jihadists, which Israel helps them with all the time. The Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords are almost all good news. All right. The UAE, there were the prime minister was just in the UAE to meet with the crown prince. The UAE made all kinds of fantastic comments about full engagement. This is peace between people. We're not going back. What was in the past didn't work. This is a new day. The Saudi crown prince, right? MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, was interviewed last week, and they asked him, do you think that Saudi Arabia might follow some of the other Arab nations in having an open relationship and diplomatic relations with Israel? Pretty pointed question, right on the money. He says, we don't look at Israel as an enemy. We look at them as a potential ally with many interests that we can pursue together, unquote. That's a fantastic, we're not there. I would argue we're not there because the king, who is still alive, but not the effective day-to-day running the country, does not want to make peace with Israel. He's of the old school, and he's elderly, he's ill. When he dies, my prediction, within 6 months of the king's passing, MBS will join the Abraham Accords, and will establish diplomatic relations and make peace with Israel. Morocco. Morocco signed a peace agreement, relations with Israel, and Morocco's national air carrier will launch a direct air route between Casablanca and Tel Aviv yesterday, 4 flights a week. That's real, tangible relationship stuff. It's great. A high-speed fiber optic data cable is being laid under the Red Sea to connect Israel to Saudi Arabia, which will further integrate Israel into the Middle East Arab Gulf states. It's a fantastic, these are really important elements. There was a news blurb that Israeli F-35s intercepted 3 Iranian UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, last year. What's important about that is that 2 of the UAVs were carried out prior to them entering Israeli airspace in coordination with neighboring countries. Read between the lines. Israeli aircraft are operating over Arab countries. That's and they're admitting it. And it's with their approval. That's huge. It's one thing that Israel is flying planes over Lebanon, because Lebanon can't shoot them down, or Syria because Russia has got their anti-aircraft systems on stand down. But in this case, if it's coming from Iran, they were almost certainly operating either over Jordan or Iraq or Saudi Arabia. So it depends on what route the UAVs were coming. Egypt, El-Sisi, right? President El-Sisi. Egypt is adopting a new approach to Israel and is striving to deepen economic and commercial ties above the table publicly, okay? There's a new deal to increase the amount of natural gas that is being sold from Israel's Leviathan field in the Mediterranean to Egypt. Right now, that pipeline is full. It's sending 2 million cubic meters of gas a day. I don't know if it's a day. I apologize. Anyway, the quantity is 2 million MCMs, million cubic meters, billion cubic meters. Must be a year to Egypt. All right, and Egypt is compressing it into liquefied natural gas, which they have a terminal, and they're sending it over to Europe. The new deal is to increase that by 3.5 billion, so from 2 to 5.5 billion cubic meters. Israel intends to have an expanded pipeline built by the end of 23 to accommodate that. So these are huge economic ties and developments. It's really great news. There was a quote: Israeli, UAE, and Jordanian trucks travel between Israel and the UAE via Saudi Arabia filled with Israeli goods. Now, if you would have told me that that was going to be happening a few years ago, or a couple of years ago, forget about it, right? Israel is providing water. Israel is irrigating agricultural fields in Jordan, right, with water that Israel has desalinated. Right? They're taking water out of the Red Sea or out of the Med, and they're desalinating it, and they're sending it to Jordan to keep Jordan afloat. A couple other miscellaneous positive points that I think are feel good and important. A group of 90 Jewish orphans aged 2 to 12 fleeing Ukraine after the Russian invasion arrived in Israel on Sunday, part of 300 on a rescue flight. So Israel is already taking in plane loads full of Ukrainian Jews, including 90 orphans. I thought the little commentary on it was the children fled with the help of local Chabad groups last week when they crossed the border to Romania and then flew to Israel. Israel appoints, and here's my last piece. Hang on one second. Lee, you got somebody at the front door, baby. Israel appointed their first Muslim Supreme Court justice. Now, they've had Israeli Arabs on the Supreme Court since 2003. They had a Maronite Christian justice and they had an Arab Christian justice. This is the first Muslim Supreme Court justice. So, further evidence of take your apartheid arguments and throw them out the door. That is what I have. Questions, Q&A, happy to engage in any conversation, anything that came up. We have anybody in chat? My moderators?
There's nobody in chat. Melanie is going to check with the lounge people to see if they have any questions.
Well, I will say that I so appreciate you guys tuning in and logging on and getting, hopefully we're at the end of this craziness of Zoom, and because I sure prefer to wander around the room and talk directly to you guys. And I mean, this is a second best I get. I mean, it's better than nothing for sure, but it's just not the same. I sure love schmoozing with you guys and seeing you. And
Do you have a question?
good.
Jory.
I'm ready.
Melanie, you muted.
Unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear us now?
Yes.
Okay, hi Dan, that was a great informative discussion. We really,
Uh-oh. I lost you at really.
Yeah, they're dealing with some Wi-Fi issues. Melanie, if you want to just put it in the chat, I can read it if that would be easier.
Hi, Jory.
hi Dan. What I wanted to ask you about was, I was listening to Michael Oren this morning where he was talking about, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Okay, so I heard him say, that Israel is really the only democracy that is not supporting publicly Ukraine. And I know you addressed this a little bit, but, he sounded very concerned, as well as I am, about how that's going to be perceived.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an absolutely valid point. It's a very strong argument in both directions. I think that Israel's intention and desire, or let me say it, their desire is certainly to come out unequivocally in support of Ukraine. But having said that, they live in a neighborhood where Hezbollah is a gigantic risk to Israel's safety and their infrastructure. And Russia has the key to their being able to at least slow walk Iranian, not uranium, excuse me, Iranian presence on their northern border. And so Israel certainly runs to the rescue every time there's a disaster, but they can't run to the rescue militarily for the world. And so they are in a very difficult place. I mean, I'm sure that whatever Michael Oren, who I love, said, I'm sure it was very valid, and I'm sure they were very good points. And they're just in a corner that has, it's all about the least bad options. There are no good options for Israel in this Ukrainian-Russian problem.
Right. I really just wish that Israel would do a lot better PR in explaining what their quandary is. And I think that to them, particularly at this time.
Yeah. Well, the quote I read early on from Natan Sharansky, I mean, this was a large editorial, and Sharansky, I'm sure, said the same thing that Michael Oren did. But he was at least even-handed enough to say, but this is the problem that Israel has. Yes, Israel should be unequivocally, their moral responsibility is to unequivocally support Ukraine and denounce Russia. But, they got big-time problems in the north, and they can't afford to alienate Putin. Putin's got a full plate right now. The last thing Israel needs is to get Putin's attention or catch him while he's in a bad mood. So that he says, well, I'll tell you what, I'll show you what I can do to you. I mean, it's just a bad situation. You're absolutely right. But that's why I brought it up straight away, because it is a big issue. But I don't know that Israel, I think maybe their best path is to be a mediator and a negotiator and a go-between, because it makes them look like, okay, we have to stay neutral in order to be a good intermediary. I don't know. It's a lose-lose. Yeah, Sylvia.
Yeah. So I read something from those news that I get that they leaked out that the meeting with Bennett and
Putin or Zelensky.
Yeah, that he told them to Ukraine, you have to let Russia do what they're doing, because so from that point of view, they're not being intermediary, they're being given to Russia. I don't know if that's true though.
Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of reports for sure. I would be surprised if Israel really said that to
I don't believe it either.
Yeah, I'd be pretty skeptical about that.
But they were always going to blame the Jews for anything. So,
well, I mean, I had a whole series of statistics and so on the history of Jews in Ukraine. I just decided that was a little off topic.
It's not very nice, I'm sure.
Yeah, well, it's you're looking at about 1.5 million Jews were killed in Ukraine by both the Nazis and the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were very, very, very glad to participate in the massacre of the Jews. It was not. Now, that's not to say that the country is the same now, and that the attitudes, they actually have the best attitude of Eastern European countries in accepting the Jews. I think they did a poll and only 5% of Ukrainians said that they wouldn't want Jewish citizens. And Romania is like at 22%. So, I mean, and other countries are in between. So they are more tolerant than other Eastern European countries, but their history is pretty bad. Anybody else?
We have another question here, yes. Go ahead, Manny.
Yeah, Dan, I got a simple question. You had mentioned about the 100,000 Jewish people being sent to Israel, which is a great thing. Somehow you didn't mention, I'd heard something about sending 100,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel also. Is that sort of in the back burner or what?
Okay, so that's a great question. First of all, the 100,000 Ukrainian Olim is an estimate. That's not a hard and fast. That's just a guess of how many will want to leave the country and come to Israel. Israel, I believe, recently agreed to bring some of the Falasha Ethiopian Jews that are still in Ethiopia, another tranche of them that have been trying to get to Israel for years. I don't think it's anywhere, I don't know the exact number, Manny, but I don't think it's anywhere near 100,000. I think it's in the thousands or low tens of thousands. And I would imagine that they'll execute that transfer, that they'll get those people out of Ethiopia and to Israel. I don't think that this will matter. Your comment, though, brings up a thought that has run around in my head quite often. It's not Israel, but so how many Ukrainians is the United States going to accept? And is the excuse not to accept X versus Y? Well, we've already got 1 million people coming in across the southern border. How are we going to take in 100,000 Ukrainians? And I'm waiting to see that conversation, because they're both humanitarian conversations. But I would submit that it's a more urgent need to accept people who are fleeing people, a war where they're trying to kill them and level their country, than to accept people who are coming, my opinion, for jobs. It'll be interesting to see if that conversation develops here in the United States. I think it will.
But it's coming up also the Afghanis that have been trying to come in because they helped the United States when they were during the war in Afghanistan, and they haven't been able to come in.
There you go. As I said, international geopolitics, complicated always. Yeah. Anything else? Well, I thank you again, as always. I really appreciate you guys tuning in. And now Melanie and Sarah. Oh, Chag Sameach for Purim to everybody.
Yeah,
Hope everybody
thank
has
you.
eats at least one hamantashen.
Thank you, Dan, so
Thank
much.
you.
That was great talk. I just want to share some upcoming things really quick, and I'm going to put them in the chat as well. So our next Middle East update is going to be with Mark, and that's going to be Thursday, May 12th at 10:30 over Zoom. And then we also hope that you'll join us in person this Friday at 1, because we're having a very special Purim Senior Lounge. We actually have a young guest from Israel joining us who's going to be talking about Purim in Israel. So it should be really fun. And then this Sunday, Marquetta is going to be here, and she's going to share her experience as an immigrant and what the American dream means to her. And that is this Sunday, I believe, at 2. I didn't write down the time. I'm just double checking that super quick. Please bear with me.
10:30 in the morning, I believe.
Oh, 10:30. I was completely wrong. 10:30 in the morning. I have links to register for both of those. If you're interested in Marquetta's talk, please do register ASAP. We do need a minimum number of people to run that program. So I'm going to send that right now. And yeah, that's what I wanted to share. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and I hope to see everyone soon. Bye.